The following story was told to me by an acquaintance I knew years ago in Utah named Noah. He was originally from Sweden and worked as an environmental researcher for 35 years. Noah was a quiet man, serious, but when he told me this story, his hands trembled slightly, and his voice lowered as though he feared the very memory might summon something back into the room. I have paraphrased it as best as I remember. He began with the simple line, "I worked in a research outpost in Antarctica back in 1993. I haven't been back. Something is being deliberately hidden." He explained that the mission was ordinary at first. They were a small team of 4 men, each tasked with studying glacial calving as it related to climate change and atmospheric emissions. The trip was meant to last 3 months, starting at the cusp of the Antarctic summer in November and ending in February. Their living quarters were nothing more than a steel-walled cabin, 4 cots crammed together in one room, and a small work desk overflowing with wires, radios, and notebooks. By day, they were absorbed by the beauty of Antarctica, which he described as equal parts mesmerizing and merciless. Endless sheets of ice stretched farther than the eye could see, occasionally collapsing in massive thunderous roars as entire sections of glacier sheared away and fell into dark water. He said the earth seemed alive there, shifting in ways that mocked the idea that it was lifeless. Yet the nights were another story entirely. Inside the cramped station, they tried to keep sane with small comforts, cards, jokes, and sometimes more alcohol than was wise. It was on a Thursday night, about 4 weeks in, when the strange events began. They had been drinking, laughing so hard that tears blurred their vision, and one of the men, Anthony, suddenly stopped them with a raised hand. "You hear that?" he asked. Noah recalled the sudden stillness in the room. Anthony turned down the radio. At first, they all thought he was teasing because there was nothing but the low hum of equipment and the soft rattle of wind against steel walls. Then it came. A sound none of them should have heard in that place. Wolves. Distant, faint howls curling in the frozen air like smoke. Noah said that their laughter drained from the room instantly. They exchanged looks, each face pale in the dim yellow light. Wolves do not live in Antarctica. Nothing like that could survive there. He reminded me of his words with force. There is nothing down there. No wolves, no dogs, not even Inuits with sled teams. Nothing. The howls came again, closer this time, drawn out and mournful, yet layered with something hungry in their tone. Anthony pressed his ear toward the window and shook his head. They pulled the curtain aside and stared into the barren tundra. The sky was painted in the haze of a dying sun, purple and fading, but the ice stretched empty as ever. No movement, no shadows, only the sound. Dennis tried to reason, mumbling that it could be whales, though they were miles from the coast and perched atop ice 1,000 meters thick. Noah said he watched Dennis's own words wilt into silence because none of them believed it. There was no way sound carried like that through ice and snow. Another wave of howls rose up, this time from more than one throat. The sound of a pack. Noah felt a charge in his stomach like a live current and realized every man in that room wore the same mask of terror. Their breath fogged heavily in the air, and the silence between each call was worse than the sound itself. Someone said to open the window, to make sure it wasn't some trick of the walls. When they cracked it, the chill bit through instantly, but the sound poured in clearer and undeniable. Wolves. Dozens of them, their cries tangled and stretched as though circling the station unseen. Dennis slammed the window shut again, his hands shaking, and nobody objected. The howling continued for nearly an hour. Noah told me he knows because he stared at the digital clock by Mel's cot the entire time, unable to pull his eyes away. He said he felt as though if he moved or spoke, the sound might surge closer and tear through the thin steel walls. For nearly 60 minutes they sat in silence, listening to a pack of animals that should not exist there. Finally, it faded. First one voice, then another, until there was nothing but the rattle of wind again. Morning brought no relief. Anthony had recorded the sounds, every chilling second of them, though playing the tape only deepened their unease. They called in for a helicopter from a station 40 miles away. Before it arrived, the four of them went out in each direction, searching for tracks, prints, disturbances in the snow, anything that could explain it. But there was nothing. No paw marks, no signs of digging, no indication that any creature had passed by in days. When the helicopter came, its crew swept the area with equipment and even circled overhead in widening loops, scanning for 10 miles in every direction. Nothing. Just tundra, untouched, silent. For the remainder of their trip, the team refused to acknowledge the sounds again. They spoke about it in passing, but no one dared to stay up late or listen too carefully when the wind carried strange notes. They made it through the rest of their mission without another incident, but Noah admitted that his sense of reality had changed. 2.5 years later, the Swedish government shut down their research station without explanation. Other outposts remained, but theirs was dismantled and erased as if it had never been there. He shrugged when telling me this part, saying perhaps it was technical, maybe political, but in his eyes, it was deliberate. He believed someone knew what they had heard and wanted to bury it. He ended the story with a line I will never forget. That night was the most frightening thing I have ever faced, and I nearly drowned as a child. I know what fear is, but this was different. Something was out there. Wolves don't live in Antarctica, but they were there. When he finished speaking, Noah sat back in his chair, his hands clasped tightly as though to keep them from trembling. I asked him if he would ever return. He shook his head once, firmly, eyes drifting toward the floor. I have never forgotten the way his voice lingered on that final sentence, carrying the weight of a memory that refused to die. Whatever lives in the desert of Antarctica, whatever circles in the snow at the coordinates of 77 degrees east and 160 degrees east, it is not meant for us to find. And perhaps it is better that way. This story was told to me by a man named Julian, whom I met in Seattle in 2011. He was in his 60s then, with thinning gray hair and a quiet demeanor. He had spent much of his life working as a field geologist and had been stationed in remote corners of the world. But when our conversation turned to Antarctica, his tone changed. He hesitated before speaking, as though deciding whether to share something long buried. When he finally did, his hands shook just slightly. What follows is paraphrased from memory, but I will never forget the unease that settled in me as he spoke. In 1988, Julian was part of a small research group surveying ice cores deep in the Antarctic interior. Their purpose was to drill down thousands of feet into the ice and pull up samples that could reveal Earth's climate history over hundreds of thousands of years. It was demanding, repetitive work, but Julian had always been fascinated by the idea of touching time itself, holding ancient snow that had fallen long before human civilization. The outpost was primitive, a collection of steel cabins linked by narrow tunnels of compacted snow, half buried in drifts that shifted with the wind. They lived in near constant cold and silence. Nights lasted forever, and the wind howled like something alive. Yet Julian said the first few weeks were calm enough. They worked, they logged their data, they ate their bland meals, and they tried to ignore the gnawing isolation. It was in the fourth week that things changed. The drill team brought up a core sample from nearly 2,500 feet below the surface. Normally, these cores were smooth cylinders of compressed ice, but this one was different. Embedded deep inside, about halfway down the 3-meter shaft of ice, was a shape. At first, they thought it was a distortion or fracture line, but when they held it up to the light, they saw it more clearly. It looked like a face. Not perfectly preserved, not human exactly, but unmistakably shaped, with hollows like eyes and a protrusion like a nose. The team stared at it in silence. Some laughed nervously, dismissing it as a trick of ice formation. But Julian said he felt a deep wrongness in his stomach. The features were too defined, too symmetrical to be chance. He said the ice around it seemed darker, too, as if stained or aged differently than the rest. They argued about what to do. Protocol demanded they cut it into sections, bag it, and send it back for analysis. But 2 of the men refused to touch it. In the end, Julian himself sealed the core, though he admitted his hands shook as he did it. That night, he woke to a sound in the corridor outside his bunk, a scraping, dragging noise like something heavy sliding along the floor. He sat up, listening, heart pounding. The others stirred too. One of them, a man named Leon, opened the door and stepped into the hall with a flashlight. He shone it left and right, but the passage was empty. The noise had stopped. The following night it happened again. This time the sound came from the storage cabin where the ice cores were kept. They went in together and found nothing disturbed. The sealed tubes stood neatly in their racks, but Julian swore he heard a faint cracking sound from the tube with the face in the side, like ice fracturing under pressure. After that, sleep became scarce. The men grew tense, jumpy, snapping at each other over small things. One morning they found Leon sitting alone in the storage cabin, staring at the core with wide eyes. He said he thought he saw the ice moving, like the features beneath were shifting. They pulled him away, but the damage was done.
He withdrew into himself, refusing to work or speak much after that. On the 7th night after retrieving the core, Julian woke again to that scraping sound. This time it was louder, closer, as if right outside their bunk room. Then came a knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps against the metal wall. The men froze in their bunks. No one moved. The knocks came again, harder this time, echoing through the steel. When they finally opened the door, the hall was empty, but the floor showed a trail of moisture leading toward the storage cabin, faint lines of melted frost as though something wet had been dragged along. They found the sealed tube lying on the floor. The core was cracked, split down the middle. Inside, the face was gone. Panic set in. Leon began raving that they had released something buried in the ice for millennia. The others tried to calm him, insisting the crack had destroyed the illusion, that the face had never been real. But Julian said he knew better. Something was inside, something that was no longer there. The next day, Leon vanished. They searched the outpost, the surrounding drifts, but found no trace. His parka and boots were gone. The wind erased any footprints almost instantly. They radioed for help, but the nearest team could not reach them for several days. During that time, the remaining men hardly slept. They kept the lights burning and refused to leave the main cabin. But still, Julian said he heard it at night, scraping footsteps outside the door, sometimes even whispers carried on the wind. Once he swore he saw a shadow move past the frosted window, though nothing should have been out there in that endless white. When the rescue team finally arrived, Julian and the others were half mad with exhaustion. They were evacuated immediately, and the outpost was later dismantled. Leon was never found. The cracked core was taken away, but no results were ever shared. Julian told me he never worked in Antarctica again. He retired a few years later, haunted by the memory of that frozen face. He said he sometimes dreamed of it still, not as a distortion in ice, but as something looking out, waiting. He believed whatever they uncovered had been buried for a reason, and that mankind had no business disturbing it. As he finished his story, he looked at me with hollow eyes and said one last thing. The ice remembers. It holds everything, keeping it locked away until someone is foolish enough to break the seal.
This story was told to me by a man named Julian, whom I met in Seattle in 2011. He was in his 60s then, with thinning gray hair and a quiet demeanor. He had spent much of his life working as a field geologist and had been stationed in remote corners of the world. But when our conversation turned to Antarctica, his tone changed. He hesitated before speaking, as though deciding whether to share something long buried. When he finally did, his hands shook just slightly. What follows is paraphrased from memory, but I will never forget the unease that settled in me as he spoke. In 1988, Julian was part of a small research group surveying ice cores deep
in the Antarctic interior. Their purpose was to drill down thousands of feet into the ice and pull up samples that could reveal Earth's climate history over hundreds of thousands of years. It was demanding, repetitive work, but Julian had always been fascinated by the idea of touching time itself, holding ancient snow that had fallen long before human civilization. The outpost was primitive, a collection of steel cabins linked by narrow tunnels of compacted snow, half buried in drifts that shifted with the wind. They lived in near constant cold and silence. Nights lasted forever, and the wind howled like something alive. Yet Julian said the first few weeks were calm enough. They worked, they logged their data, they ate their bland meals, and they tried to ignore the gnawing isolation. It was in the fourth week that things changed. The drill team brought up a core sample from nearly 2,500 feet below the surface. Normally, these cores were smooth cylinders of compressed ice, but this one was different. Embedded deep inside, about halfway down the 3-meter shaft of ice, was a shape. At first, they thought it was a distortion or fracture line, but when they held it up to the light, they saw it more clearly. It looked like a face. Not perfectly preserved, not human exactly, but unmistakably shaped, with hollows like eyes and a protrusion like a nose. The team stared at it in silence. Some laughed nervously, dismissing it as a trick of ice formation. But Julian said he felt a deep wrongness in his stomach. The features were too defined, too symmetrical to be chance. He said the ice around it seemed darker, too, as if stained or aged differently than the rest. They argued about what to do. Protocol demanded they tut it into sections, bag it, and send it back for analysis. But 2 of the men refused to touch it. In the end, Julian himself sealed the core, though he admitted his hands shook as he did it. That night, he woke to a sound in the corridor outside his bunk, a scraping, dragging noise like something heavy sliding along the floor. He sat up, listening, heart pounding. The others stirred too. One of them, a man named Leon, opened the door and stepped into the hall with a flashlight. He shone it left and right, but the passage was empty. The noise had stopped. The following night it happened again. This time the sound came from the storage cabin where the ice cores were kept. They went in together and found nothing disturbed. The sealed tubes stood neatly in their racks, but Julian swore he heard a faint cracking sound from the tube with the face in the side, like ice fracturing under pressure. After that, sleep became scarce. The men grew tense, jumpy, snapping at each other over small things. One morning they found Leon sitting alone in the storage cabin, staring at the core with wide eyes. He said he thought he saw the ice moving, like the features beneath were shifting. They pulled him away, but the damage was done. He withdrew into himself, refusing to work or speak much after that. On the 7th night after retrieving the core, Julian woke again to that scraping sound. This time it was louder, closer, as if right outside their bunk room. Then came a knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps against the metal wall. The men froze in their bunks. No one moved. The knocks came again, harder this time, echoing through the steel. When they finally opened the door, the hall was empty, but the floor showed a trail of moisture leading toward the storage cabin, faint lines of melted frost as though something wet had been dragged along. They found the sealed tube lying on the floor. The core was cracked, split down the middle. Inside, the face was gone. Panic set in. Leon began raving that they had released something buried in the ice for millennia. The others tried to calm him, insisting the crack had destroyed the illusion, that the face had never been real. But Julian said he knew better. Something was inside, something that was no longer there. The next day, Leon vanished. They searched the outpost, the surrounding drifts, but found no trace. His parka and boots were gone. The wind erased any footprints almost instantly. They radioed for help, but the nearest team could not reach them for several days. During that time, the remaining men hardly slept. They kept the lights burning and refused to leave the main cabin. But still, Julian said he heard it at night, scraping footsteps outside the door, sometimes even whispers carried on the wind. Once he swore he saw a shadow move past the frosted window, though nothing should have been out there in that endless white. When the rescue team finally arrived, Julian and the others were half mad with exhaustion. They were evacuated immediately, and the outpost was later dismantled. Leon was never found. The cracked core was taken away, but no results were ever shared. Julian told me he never worked in Antarctica again. He retired a few years later, haunted by the memory of that frozen face. He said he sometimes dreamed of it still, not as a distortion in ice, but as something looking out, waiting. He believed whatever they uncovered had been buried for a reason, and that mankind had no business disturbing it. As he finished his story, he looked at me with hollow eyes and said one last thing. The ice remembers. It holds everything, keeping it locked away until someone is foolish enough to break the seal.
This account was shared with me in 2015 by a woman named Claire, a communications engineer I met at a small conference in Oregon. She had worked at several remote outposts over the years, but when Antarctica came up in conversation, she grew quiet. Later that evening, over coffee, she finally told me a story she said she had never shared publicly. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, but also the relief of finally letting it out. I have paraphrased it here as best as I can remember. In the early 2000s, Claire was assigned to a joint research project in Antarctica. Her job was to maintain the satellite communication systems that linked their outpost with the rest of the world. She explained that in those years, the equipment was temperamental, and the brutal colds made every repair feel like surgery performed with numb fingers. Still, she loved the challenge. Antarctica felt like standing on the edge of the world, and she believed in the work they were doing. Their outpost was small, only 6 people in total. They spent their days running experiments and logging data, and Claire spent much of her time monitoring the satellite link. The nights were long stretches of silence, broken only by the crackle of radios and the whine of the wind across empty snow. One evening, around midnight, Claire picked up something strange on the comm system. At first, it sounded like ordinary static, a low hiss rolling in and out with the storm outside. But then it shifted. Buried within the static, she could hear a pattern, a pulsing rhythm that seemed too deliberate to be random. She recorded it and listened again. 3 beats, pause. 3 beats, pause. Then a long, dragging tone. She thought perhaps it was interference from another station, but when she checked the registry, no stations were broadcasting at that frequency. The signal had no source. The next night, it returned, stronger this time, almost insistent. She played it back for the others, and they laughed it off, suggesting it was nothing but atmospheric distortion. Yet when Claire adjusted the frequency, the signal followed her, always within range, always pulsing in that same eerie rhythm. On the 3rd night, she swore she heard something else hidden in the static. A voice, not clear, but there. A low whisper riding the noise, syllables she could not decipher. It chilled her blood. She turned up the volume, but the others dismissed it as imagination, her mind trying to make words out of chaos. Still, she kept listening. By the 4th night, the signal had become almost unbearable. The pulsing grew louder, faster, filling the comms room with an oppressive thrum. Then, beneath it, a single phrase emerged, warped and distorted, but unmistakable. "We are here." Claire froze. Her hand hovered over the power switch, but she couldn't bring herself to turn it off. She said the sound rooted her in place, like being stared at by something unseen. Finally, she yanked the cord, and the room fell silent. When she told the others the next morning, they grew uneasy. Some accused her of playing a prank, but when she replayed the recording she had made, the words were gone. Only static remained. A week later, one of the researchers, a young man named Ethan, vanished. He had been scheduled to take snow measurements a short distance from the station. The weather was clear, visibility perfect, but he never returned. They searched for 2 days and found nothing. No footprints, no equipment, not even a trace of his bright red parka, as if he had walked straight into the sky. After Ethan's disappearance, the signal returned, stronger than ever. This time, everyone heard it. The pulsing filled the cabin walls, vibrating through their bones. The voice came again, not whispered, but louder now, drawn out and cold. "One gone." The team panicked. Radios were shut off, equipment dismantled, but the sound still came. It bled through the metal walls, as if the air itself carried it. At night they lay awake, hearing that pulsing rhythm echo in their heads. One of the men began bleeding from his nose during the transmissions. Another vomited uncontrollably. Claire herself suffered splitting headaches that grew worse each day. On the 12th night, another man went missing. This time, he disappeared from inside the cabin. His bunk was empty in the morning, his parka still hanging by the door. No footprints in the snow outside, no sign of struggle, just gone. The voice returned that night, whispering again through the static. 3 gone. Claire said by then the survivors were almost mad with fear. They begged for evacuation, but storms delayed the helicopters for 3 more days. In that time, they barely slept, barely ate. They sat in silence, listening to the walls hum with that black signal. On the final night before rescue, Claire swore she saw something outside the window, a dark shape against the endless white, tall and still. She blinked, and it was gone, but the signal rose in a deafening pulse that rattled every bolt of the station. The voice spoke one last time, almost triumphant. "We are here, waiting." When the helicopters finally came, they were half delirious. Only 4 remained. They left the station without looking back. Later, Claire learned the outpost was dismantled and erased from official records, much like it had never existed. She never returned to Antarctica. She told me that even years later, while lying in bed at night, she would sometimes awake to the sound of static in her ears, and beneath it, faint but clear, the same pulsing rhythm. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause. She said she would never forget the voice. We are here.
This story was told to me by a man named Frederick, a retired mechanic I met on a flight from Chicago to New York in 2017. He was quiet through most of the trip until he noticed me reading a book about polar exploration. He gave a faint smile and said he had a story about Antarctica that no one had ever believed. His tone was heavy, almost bitter, but his eyes carried the look of someone who had carried a memory far too long. In the late 1980s, Frederick was a part of a supply crew delivering fuel and equipment to remote outposts across the Antarctic continent. These runs were long, grueling trips across empty ice fields using heavy tractors that crawled slower than a man could walk. He said the isolation on those journeys was worse than any storm. You could drive for days without seeing a living thing, nothing but endless white swallowing the horizon. On one trip, his crew was rerouted to deliver supplies to a station he had never heard of before. It was marked on their map as Station H13, a designation that didn't match the usual naming system. The order came through official channels, but even their supervisor admitted he had no details on who exactly was stationed there. The coordinates were far inland, deeper than most missions ever went. They set out, 3 men in total, dragging sleds of fuel drums and crates behind their tractors. The weather was unusually calm, skies pale and windless. After nearly 5 days of travel, they reached the location, but what they found didn't match any station Frederick had ever seen. Station H13 was half buried in ice, only a low block of steel walls visible above the snow. There were no antennae, no flags, no identifiers. The hatch was sealed, but not locked. When they entered, they were struck by how empty it felt. Inside were corridors lined with rusting pipes, dim lights flickering overhead. The air was stale and carried a faint metallic tang. But the strangest part was the silence. Even in unmanned stations, there was usually the hum of generators or the creak of metal in the cold. Here, there was nothing. They expected to find researchers, or at least records of who had been there, but every room was deserted. The mess hall was clean, dishes stacked neatly, as if people had left in an orderly way. The bunks were made, the storage areas stocked with food.
There was no sign of struggle or evacuation, just absence. Then they reached the lower levels. A narrow stairwell led them down to a subfloor that stretched beneath the ice. It was colder there, their breath hanging thick in the air. The walls were different too, not the usual steel plates, but slabs of dark material that almost seemed to absorb the light. None of them recognized it. At the end of the hall was a large chamber. Inside stood rows of empty chairs arranged in a semicircle facing a blank wall. No screens, no projectors, no equipment. Just chairs bolted to the floor, as if people had once sat there and stared at nothing. Frederick swore he felt pressure in his ears while standing in that room, like descending deep underwater. The silence was so complete it hurt. His companion, a man named Alvarez, muttered that they shouldn't stay, but the third man insisted on exploring further. That was when they heard it. A low sound, faint but distinct, echoing from the walls. At first it resembled distant machinery, but it carried a rhythm that made Frederick's stomach turn, a slow thudding like a heartbeat. It reverberated through the floor, subtle but steady, as though the station itself were alive. They stood frozen. The sound grew louder the longer they listened, pounding in their chests until Alvarez shouted and bolted for the stairs. Frederick followed, dragging the last man with him. They slammed the hatch shut and didn't look back. That night they camped a mile from the station, too afraid to sleep inside. Frederick said none of them spoke, but in the early hours he awoke to find Alvarez sitting outside in the snow without his coat, staring back toward the station. His lips were moving soundlessly. Frederick pulled him back into the tent and forced him to drink water, but Alvarez's eyes were vacant. The next morning, Alvarez was gone. His parka and boots were missing, his tracks leading back toward the station before vanishing into wind-blown drifts. They searched briefly, but the silence pressing in from that direction made their skin crawl. Finally, they left without him. When they reached their base 2 days later, they reported what happened. The officials listened, but gave no comment. Later, Frederick overheard that their written report had been sealed. The mission was logged as routine. Station H-13 was never mentioned again. Years later, Frederick tried to find the location on updated maps, but it was gone. No record of any H-13, no acknowledgement that such a place ever existed. He believed the government had erased it deliberately. As he finished telling me the story, he rubbed his hands together and stared out the aeroplane window at the clouds. He said the silence of that place had never left him. Sometimes at night, when his house was quiet and the world outside still, he swore he could hear that same slow thudding in his ears, like the beating heart of something buried beneath the ice. He looked at me then, his face pale, and said one last thing. Antarctica is not empty, it is hollow, and some stations are not meant to be found.
This story was told to me by a man named Joseph, whom I met in Salt Lake City in 2009. He had been a surveyor for a Canadian geological project in the 1990s,
and claimed to have worked a short stint in Antarctica during a joint operation with American researchers. He was tired and weathered, his voice low and gravelly, and while he laughed easily at first, his tone darkened when I asked if he had ever been afraid in the field. He said yes, once, and it had been in Antarctica. Joseph and his team were tasked with mapping ice formations far inland. The land there was flat as glass, stretching to the horizon without a single landmark. Navigation was done almost entirely with GPS and compasses, though compasses often failed that far south. He explained that the sensation of standing in the middle of that frozen plain was like floating in space. No frame of reference, no shadows, only white in every direction. Their assignment required them to set temporary marker poles to measure drift and glacial movement. It was monotonous work, placing a pole, logging its coordinates, then driving another mile to repeat the process. There were 4 men in the group, 2 vehicles, and a schedule that allowed little room for error. It was on the 7th day that something went wrong. They had set a line of markers stretching for 10 miles when the wind began to rise. At first it was a light push, but soon it built into a screaming gale that erased their tracks in seconds. They decided to retreat to their last camp, but the GPS unit began flickering. Joseph said the numbers on the display jumped back and forth, sometimes reading their position as miles away from where they stood. That was when they noticed one of the markers they had planted earlier was missing. They were certain of its location. Joseph remembered the act of hammering it into the ice himself, but when they returned to check the spot, it was gone. No pole, no hole, no sign it had ever been placed. They pressed on, unnerved but unwilling to stop in the open wind. A few minutes later, another pole was missing, then another. It was as if the markers were being erased behind them, one by one. The storm worsened. Visibility shrank to almost nothing, the horizon lost in a wall of blowing snow. They had no choice but to tie themselves together with rope and walk the last stretch back to camp on foot. Joseph said the sound of the wind was deafening, like thousands of voices whispering at once, but underneath it he thought he heard another sound, a low humming that seemed to come from beneath the ice. Halfway through their return, one of the men, Stanley, began shouting. He claimed he saw the lights of camp directly ahead, though the others could see nothing. He pulled at the rope, desperate to break free, but Joseph and the others restrained him. When the storm finally broke and visibility returned, they found themselves standing in a blank expanse with no camp in sight. Their GPS still flickered nonsense. They set up an emergency tent and huddled through the night. Stanley refused to speak. At dawn they emerged to orient themselves. That was when they saw the tracks. A line of footprints trailed away from their tent, leading out into the empty plain. They were Stanley's boots, but Stanley was still lying inside, staring at the ceiling with glassy eyes. Joseph said the prints extended in a perfect straight line toward the horizon until they vanished into white. They woke Stanley, demanded answers, but he only muttered that he had already gone. 2 hours later, he was gone for real. Joseph swore he had only turned his back for a moment, but when he looked again, the rope that bound them together was frayed at Stanley's end and his place empty. His footprints stretched once more toward the horizon, perfectly parallel to the ones from the day before, but this time they stopped abruptly, as if he had simply dissolved into the air. The remaining men pushed themselves to move quickly, desperate to escape. At last they stumbled onto a flagged route belonging to another team and followed it back to a known station. When they reported Stanley missing, the officials took notes but offered little reaction, as though such disappearances were not unexpected. Joseph tried to return to the area weeks later using their logged coordinates, but the record showed no such trip had ever been authorized. The maps carried no marks of their marker line. Even the GPS data they had uploaded was missing from the archives. Stanley's name was eventually listed as lost to exposure. Joseph never forgot the look in Stanley's eyes before he vanished, the certainty that he had already walked away long before his body did. When Joseph finished his story, he leaned forward and said quietly, "The ice is not as empty as it seems." He believes there are places in Antarctica where the earth folds inward, places where direction loses meaning, where distance erases itself. He called it the vanishing point. He warned me that men do not simply die there, they are unmade, their presence erased like chalk washed from a board. And as the plane began its descent that day, Joseph smiled faintly and said he sometimes dreams of a white plane with 2 sets of footprints leading out forever, both his own. He wakes not knowing whether he ever truly came back.
The following was relayed to me by a colleague named Richard, a historian who spent years cataloging personal writings from early polar expeditions. He once showed me a photocopy of a tattered journal page, the ink faded and smudged, the handwriting sharp and uneven, as though scrawled by a shaking hand. The original belonged to a British glaciologist named Arthur Hale, last stationed in Antarctica in 1961. Official records list him as having died from hypothermia after becoming separated from his team. But Richard insisted the journal pages told a different story, one that has never been made public. The entry began on what must have been his 3rd month. It described how the nights had grown restless, long stretches of silence broken by faint vibrations in the ice under his cot. At first, he thought it was ordinary seismic activity, but the tremors seemed to repeat in a pattern, as if deliberate. He wrote of lying awake counting the seconds between each pulse, and how sometimes the rhythm would match his own heartbeat until he could not tell which was which. Days were spent drilling ice cores, cataloging samples, recording temperatures. The monotony was a comfort at first, but the further into the season they went, the more Arthur claimed to see strange things in the ice. In one entry, he mentioned a core sample that contained what looked like fine strands of hair frozen in the crystal. He described it as human, blonde, impossibly preserved in ice that should have been millions of years old. His superiors dismissed it as mineral impurity, but Arthur could not stop staring at the strands under the magnifying glass,
convinced he saw them shift ever so slightly when he turned away. A later entry became more disjointed. He wrote of hearing voices outside the station during a whiteout storm, voices speaking in a language he did not recognize. He swore he heard his name being called, first softly, then with increasing urgency. When he rushed to the window, he saw nothing but swirling snow. But the next morning, he found footprints circling the station, faint but human-shaped, leading back into the endless expanse where no one could survive. He wrote of his fellow researchers behaving strangely, one by one. At dinner they would fall into trances, staring at the walls without speaking. At night they would rise from their bunks and stand at the windows for hours, unmoving, as if waiting for something out there in the frozen dark. Arthur began sleeping with a lantern on, but it did little to calm him. He described the creeping sense that the ice itself was watching, listening, waiting for him to let his guard down. The last coherent entries grew desperate. Arthur wrote of dreams in which he walked through tunnels of ice, smooth and wet as though carved by hands, not nature. He described a light glowing at the end of the passage, faint and green, and the sound of wolves howling, though he knew there were no wolves on the continent. He began to dread sleep, but could not resist the pull of the dreams. He confessed in shaky lines that part of him wanted to follow the tunnels, to see where they led, even if it meant never returning. Then came the final entry. The handwriting was uneven, the ink blotted, the words scrawled in fragments. The ice is hollow beneath us. The voices know my name. I saw myself walking outside in the snow. I am inside and outside at the same time. The green light is waiting. I will go now. The rest of the page was torn. Richard told me the journal was recovered from a sealed storage box decades after Arthur's disappearance, buried in an archive mislabeled under geological data. The station logs recorded his death as accidental exposure, but the journal suggests he walked willingly into the storm. When they found his body, Richard said it was standing upright in the snow, eyes open, frozen solid, facing toward the horizon as though awaiting something to return. The disturbing part, Richard whispered, was not Arthur's fate, but the final detail in the recovery notes. Beneath the ice, near where Arthur's body was found, searchers discovered a hollow cavity stretching down hundreds of feet. At the bottom of the shaft was a faint glow, green and shifting, like light filtered through water. The cavity was sealed, the findings struck from the records, the journal archived away where no one would read it, until Richard found it. When he finished telling me this, Richard closed his briefcase and stared out the window. He said sometimes late at night he feels a vibration in the floorboards of his house, faint but steady, like something pulsing beneath the ground. He swears he still dreams of the tunnels Arthur described, and that sometimes he hears his own name whispered from within the walls of ice. The journal of Arthur Hale has since disappeared from the archive again, and Richard himself has not answered my calls in over a year.
The following is an excerpt I once read from a supposed military report connected to Operation High Jump a massive U.S. naval mission to Antarctica in 1947, officially described as a scientific expedition. I cannot verify its authenticity, but it bore the insignia of the Navy and carried the weight of truth in its dry, clinical tone. What struck me most was how the language of fact seemed to collapse under the weight of something too strange to categorize. The document opened by stating that the fleet had been deployed to the Ross Sea region, consisting of over 4,000 personnel, 13 ships, and dozens of aircraft. Their mission objectives were listed as mapping unexplored areas, testing equipment in extreme conditions, and asserting a U.S. presence on the continent. Yet scattered throughout the typed paragraphs were redactions, blacking out entire sections, and words scratched over with ink. The first notable entry described a routine flyover of the ice shelf by a squadron of aircraft. The official tone slipped when describing an anomalous region approximately 200 miles inland, where the snow appeared to collapse in circular depressions as if hollow beneath. The pilots reported difficulty with instruments, compasses spinning, radios filled with static, engines struggling without reason. The report noted the crew's psychological state as agitated, unnerved, and resistant to further reconnaissance. The commander ordered additional flights. One pilot recorded seeing what he described as dark openings in the ice, massive caverns that descended vertically for hundreds of feet, with light glowing faintly from within. He claimed he saw movement inside, though visibility was poor. The account was struck through with pen, but still legible. Another note in the margin stated simply, "Do not investigate." A week later, an incident occurred that was not explained anywhere else in the file. One destroyer reported distress signals from a nearby escort ship, and when support arrived, the vessel was adrift, with no crewmen visible on deck. A boarding party entered and found the interior in disarray, equipment smashed, bunks overturned. Not a single crewman was recovered. The only trace was a set of frozen footprints leading off the deck into the ice, dozens of them, all bare. The ship was scuttled and the event stricken from the official mission log. Later entries grew even stranger. Several aircraft failed to return from survey flights. The survivors described being harassed by what they thought were other aircraft, fast-moving shapes that appeared from nowhere, diving and rising with impossible agility. The official wording referred to them as hostile aerial phenomena. A handful of pilots insisted the objects emitted a sound like animal howls over their radios, disrupting communication. The loss of aircraft was attributed to storms, though weather records showed clear skies at the time. The strangest section concerned Admiral Richard Byrd himself, the commander of the mission. According to the file, after one of the final flights, Byrd was debriefed in private. The transcript was heavily redacted, but fragments survived. Byrd spoke of descending into a hollow, of being guided by lights, of voices warning that humanity was on a path of destruction. He claimed to have seen structures beneath the ice, immense and ancient, not of human origin. The officers present marked the statement as psychological stress and classified the record at the highest level. The mission was abruptly terminated weeks ahead of schedule. The fleet returned with the official explanation of equipment damage and personnel fatigue. The report stated losses at 64 men, though elsewhere the number 94 was written and scratched out.
The report concluded that further exploration of the anomalous regions was prohibited for the safety of personnel and security of operations. What unsettled me most were the handwritten notes at the very end, in a different hand than the rest of the document. They read like a warning, almost like someone's conscience breaking through the official silence. There is something alive beneath the ice. We are not alone here. They warned us once, and they will not warn again. The howling is real, and the sky is not empty. Seal the files. Forget this place. The file ended there. No signatures, no acknowledgement. Just a stamped word in faded ink. Classified. I was told later that dozens of supposed copies of this file had surfaced over the years, only to vanish from archives and libraries without explanation. Some claimed the Russians found the same anomalies during their own missions. Others said modern satellite imaging has been deliberately blurred over certain coordinates. When I asked Richard, the same colleague who had shown me Arthur Hale's journal, he said this: "Antarctica keeps its secrets well. The ice remembers more than it should, and the things buried there are patient." I should not still be alive, but somehow I am. I write this not because I believe rescue will come, but because the silence out here is too heavy, and words are the only thing that make me feel human again. My name is Daniel, a climatologist sent down to Antarctica in 2011 for a 6-month research project that turned into something I will never speak of if I leave this place. It started with a supply issue. The station at McMurdo Ridge was small, barely a skeleton crew of 6 of us. Weather cut the flights short, and delays stretched into weeks. We had enough rations, but not much else. Power was temperamental. The wind outside screamed constantly against the steel siding, and sometimes it felt like it was inside the walls too. By the 2nd month, one of our generators failed. That was when people started seeing things. Anna, our glaciologist, swore she saw lights moving across the horizon in patterns too sharp to be auroras. She said they blinked like signals. Tom, the medic, told me he heard voices in the empty corridors at night, always behind him, never ahead. I laughed when he told me, until it started happening to me too. The footsteps came first, slow and deliberate, crossing the hall outside my bunk. I thought it was Mark or Dennis going for supplies, but when I opened the door, the hall was empty and cold enough that my breath rose in clouds. Then came the whispering. At first faint, like wind under the door, then sharper, like words I could almost understand. By the 3rd week, I had stopped sleeping altogether. One night, Anna screamed. We rushed into the common room and found her staring out the window, her face pale. She said the lights were closer now, so close she could see shapes moving inside them. When we looked, there was nothing but the blank dark ice and the endless wind. Tom said she was losing her mind. The next morning, she was gone. Her parka and boots were missing. The door left ajar. No footprints outside. Just gone. Mark said we had to radio for evacuation, but every time we tried, the signal was drowned in static. Except sometimes in the static, we heard the howling. Not the wind, not a machine, but wolves, dozens of them, deep and sharp and wrong. Wolves do not live here, but I swear they circled the base for hours, though nothing appeared when we checked. Then Dennis vanished too. He had been on night watch. We found his parka lying neatly folded by the door, his flashlight still on, beam cutting across the snow. No prints, no trail, just absence. By then, Tom had stopped speaking entirely. He sat in his bunk, rocking back and forth, muttering in a language I did not know. His lips cracked and bled. When I shook him, he screamed like a child and clawed at my face. That night I heard the door open again. I was too afraid to stop him. By morning, he was gone too. Only Mark and I remained. The walls seemed to shrink around us. The lights flickered at odd hours. Once, during a blackout, I swear I saw something pressed against the window glass, something too tall, too thin, with eyes reflecting light that wasn't there. Mark told me I imagined it, but he would not look at the windows anymore after that. 2 nights later, I woke to the sound of him talking. He was standing in the common room, staring at the radio, whispering into the static like it was answering him. His face was calm, almost happy. I asked what he was doing. He turned slowly and smiled in a way that did not belong to him. Then he walked to the door and stepped outside without his parka, without gloves, just bare skin in -40. I screamed for him, but he never looked back. I could not bring myself to follow. Now I am alone. The generator is nearly dead. Food will last another week, maybe 2 if I ration. The whispers are constant now, seeping through the walls, inside my head. I can no longer tell if they are outside or in me. Sometimes I think I hear Anna's voice or Mark's voice calling my name. Sometimes I hear my own. Last night the lights returned. They hovered above the ice, pulsing, closer than ever. Shadows moved between them. I could see their shapes, long and bending in ways I cannot describe. They circled the station for hours while the wolves howled. At some point, I think I started howling with them. I do not know how much longer I can resist opening the door. There is something waiting out there in the dark. Maybe it is death, maybe it is something worse. But the silence inside is heavier than the storm outside, and the voices tell me it will be easier if I just join them. If anyone finds this journal, know this: Antarctica is not empty. It is not lifeless. It is watching, and once it sees you, it does not let you go. The lights are here again. I can see them through the cracks in the shutters. They are beautiful. I think I will open the door now.